Hey there, and welcome to Work Dope, a podcast on the messiness and the potential of humans at work. I'm Linda Stacy, and I'm a corporate sellout and a corporate innovator. And I think that working in corporate America doesn't have to suck, even though it often does. By some statistics, up to 80% of the workforce are dissatisfied in their work. On the flip side of this, the paradox here is that folks more and more are expecting to derive meaning and purpose in their lives through their roles at work. In today's climate, all of this has forced us to take a look at quality of life and what culture really means for people inside organizations. I do think that business and organizational life can be cool and interesting. I think that building things and solving real world problems, creating, these are all fundamental to the best parts of the human experience. This is one of the ways that we embrace human potential. Work Dope is on a mission to reinvent the work experience and is committed to bringing insights, tools, and inspiration to employees at all levels in an organization, most importantly, the individual contributors, the folks with the tireless jobs that keep the wheels from falling off the bus. In this episode, I'm speaking with Kevin Judge. Kevin is the CEO and founder of iNOBL, a strategic advisory firm. iNOBL helps executives maximize buy-in, alignment, and execution for the most critical strategic initiatives so they can drive results for their business, their people, and themselves. Kevin works with leaders to define strategy, operationalize plans, and ready their talent so the whole company is effective at executing for success. I was connected with Kevin because I was doing deliberate outreach to learn more about and from people who work specifically on values within organizations, and this is one aspect of what Kevin does. We talk about three things that come up that seem to trip up what's going on in organizations, what's getting in the way of success. And those three things are people, process, and technology from Kevin's viewpoint. We talk about the emotional culture approach. This is what was tying into my question around values. We talk about the emotional culture approach, which is a system that Kevin uses to help align and get teams understanding what they want to feel, what they want to exude, what the values should be, and how to operationalize those values within a team, a group, or an organization. It's really interesting discussion as it relates to humans at work. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hello, Kevin. How are you today?
I am fantastic. Thanks for having me here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to have you on Work Dope. I have read a formal bio in the intro to this podcast, and I'd love to hear from you directly what you tell folks casually at a cocktail party and some other casual setting, what you do for work.
Well, it really depends on who the individual is that I'm talking to. The best way for me to put it is I help organizations close the strategy to execution gap. You see, there's so much emphasis for organizations on big goals that they have, but then they get stuck in the day-to-day firefighting and the tactical work that happens. And the next thing you know, months, quarters, years have gone by and they haven't achieved these strategic goals that they have. So I really look at how I can help them focus in on those critical initiatives that they have and make sure that they get done through the talent that they have.
Through the talent they have. So what's getting in the way? You mentioned firefighting. It's people issues primarily is what you're dealing with, yes? Or
a lot of the time. So I think of three different things that often get in the way, and it's people, process, and technology. Right? So people is a huge component of what we do. I often joke with people, work would be so much easier if we didn't have to deal with people.
Absolutely.
But that's not the reality that we're faced with today.
Yeah.
That's people are a critical piece of what every business does. Sometimes people get caught up in the way that they're working. They don't have the skills or the knowledge that they need. Sometimes it's about how they feel at work, or just their own drive and attitudes and ability to perform, right? So sometimes that is the piece, but also at other times it's around process. There's the way we do things in an organization, whether that be step-by-step process or making decisions or communicating, etc. that can get in the way of
Sure.
delivering the results that we want. And then, of course, technology is always fun and constantly changing
Mm.
with the hope to create even better results and productivity. But that in itself creates a whole bunch of challenges for organizations.
Yeah. Yeah. When you talk about process, that's in particular kind of one that gets me at this particular moment in my life. Just that there are some things it's like, we're never going to get there until we can kind of make this more smooth. There's such a time sink based on the way that we've set this up. So you really
Yes.
try to help people work to set things up differently, to really understand, okay, what drove it to be this way in the first place, and how can we tweak it? Look at the impacts,
Yeah, and not to be cliche, but people are I talked about firefighting earlier. Now I'm going to switch and say, people are so focused on the trees in front of them that they can't step
Yes.
back and see the forest. So
Right.
I will work with executives and leaders of teams to figure out, hey, how can we step back
Right.
and look at
Right.
everything that's going on. And a lot of the time, it really just involves talking with the people that are trying to execute on certain initiatives and
Yes.
finding out from them. They know the answers, but
I
they're too
know.
busy.
I know. I think money sometimes is like I don't know the right word for this, but it's almost like we think that we're doing something because there's a money issue. But when we really take that broader look at how much time this is actually like we need to equate that to money so that we really understand. I mean, for me in my job, it's more of a, how many licensed users are we going to have? Does it make sense to get 50 more, because there's this huge other time sink or backlog that's happening as a result of the fact that certain people can't have access to the tool.
Yeah,
And that's
absolutely.
process and technology. Anyway, go ahead.
Yes, and time is absolutely money. I was recently
Right.
sitting in an offsite meeting that I was holding with an executive team that was having some challenges working with each other. And one of the biggest challenges that they had was the amount of time they were spending in meetings. And the solution from the outside is simple. Well, reformat how you do your meetings and when do you have them, etc. But a key piece for them, a big aha moment for them was, hey, every time your executive team is in a room, it's costing you this much money. Not to mention that the time that you're not spending on other things that you could be that are more strategic and of value to the organization. So we really need to be thinking about, time is money, and are we spending that time
Right.
accordingly?
Yeah. And I think it's complicated, dynamic, whatever kind of words we want to use. I read a statistic recently that in the 50s and 60s, I think Mad Men, that's kind of like the vision I have in my head, that people spent 30%-ish time of their day, 30% of the time of the day actually at their desks. And then, so they were constantly like teaming around and buzzing with other people. And that was the nature of work. And we didn't have the technology we have now. And now in a modern workplace, if there is, people are kind of at their desk, kind of in their cube. And now there is more time in meetings, but in some ways it's like, is the interface with people just taken on a different like mode, or I don't know, something I'm thinking about.
Yeah, I agree with you. So as you were describing that, so a small part of me wishes that I grew up in the era of Mad Men with the offices and the.
Not me as a woman. I'm sorry, I completely interrupted you.
I get that.
Go ahead though, please.
I completely get that. That's not the piece that I wish was
Okay.
occurring. It's
sorry.
everybody has an office and not cubicles necessarily, right? And everybody is having that chance to interact and meet with people. And there's a key difference, I think, between those times, because you gave me a statistic of what was it, 30% of
30-ish,
time at your desk and the rest of the time is with other people. Well, I think the statistic today for the amount of time that we spend in meetings is, I don't have an exact metric, but I'm thinking I read somewhere like 90% of our time or 80% of our time, even if it's just 70% of our time in meetings with other people. Today we're going to meetings that, again, we shouldn't necessarily be in, or are ineffective and are just, quite frankly, a waste of time. Whereas in the old days,
Right.
that was about building rapport, building networks,
Yes.
influencing people,
Yes.
getting
Totally.
ideas and collaborating.
Yeah.
And the power in that is
Yeah.
so amazing.
Yeah.
And we don't have that as much today
Mm.
in many organizations.
Yeah, that's a challenge. And I mean, it's a challenge and it's kind of almost like something we should hold ourselves to. Hopefully, we're moving towards the ability to create that in these remote environments and experiences, that we get better at it.
Yeah, and it's absolutely possible to do, but it takes intention, right?
Yeah.
We have to have that intent, that desire, that drive, that purpose
Yes.
to want to collaborate, to want to make those connections.
Right. Right. Yeah, it's really something. I'm sure my brain is going to be spinning on that one for, for a little while. I'd like to ask you about your career, your path, inflection points. What's led you to this point in where you are in terms of how you serve people?
Uh, I had a very odd career. I started off the first couple of years working in a high-tech manufacturing facility alongside engineers and helping them take what was in their heads and put it on paper so that somebody on the production floor could actually run a process and test products. So that was a really great introduction to the world of technology and manufacturing. But my dream was to get into information technology. So I eventually moved into IT and had a number of different roles there. But primarily, I was a business systems analyst, and it was again, I was the guy in between the business and the owner of a system, trying to figure out what do each want and how do we communicate with each other and define and meet the expectations of every party involved. Somehow, this is where the weird inflection point is somehow I ended up in HR.
Mm.
So I was teaching a lot of information technology systems and how to make decisions based on data. And through the wonderful power of reorganizations, uh, back in the high-tech era, right when the whole tech market burst,
Yeah.
they said anybody doing a training function is now going to be part of HR. I was like, okay, sure,
Oh,
whatever
wow.
that means.
Okay.
So they moved me into HR out of IT, and it was a wonderful experience when I look back on it. Maybe not all the time that I was there, but
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot about developing others and
Mm.
organizations, and did a lot of work on leadership development, organizational culture, and that type of thing. So
Mm-hmm.
more of how do you get the organization to again deliver on those critical initiatives, and I find that fascinating. So I left the corporate world after 21 years and 27 bosses,
Mm.
and opened up my own business, and have been doing that for just about 8 years now, and am loving it.
27 bosses. That's a
Yes.
lot of experience with working with that, a lot of variability there. What percentage of
Yeah.
those would you say? I mean, this is just so broad strokes. Percentage good to bad, if you could. I mean,
Well, it's funny because I actually tell people with 27 bosses, I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And,
absolutely.
if you've got a bad boss, then be thankful because the ugly can get really,
Wow.
really ugly, right?
Wow.
So it's funny. I have a list written down somewhere of every boss I've ever worked with because I
Wow.
needed to do that count. But I'd say out of those 27, probably about 5 or 6 were like the ultimate awesome boss.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And probably about 4 or 5 were the ugly bosses,
Okay.
and then the rest in the middle.
Okay. That's that's a really great perspective you bring. I mean, to see that variation, just it's good in terms of your ability to then understand what various organizations might be dealing with now, and just the variability in humans and people.
Oh
Um,
yeah.
a little bit separate. I don't know if you could speak to this, but when you think back to being a kid growing up, I don't know, like,
Yeah.
were there any signs that that you may end up in this kind of position that you're in now? Like, I don't know. I'm pulling this on you, like,
Yeah.
just, especially whatever your favorite parts are of what you're doing now. Do you see lines, the whole way through?
Yeah, I do. Of course, it's easier for me to make the connection looking back than it would have
Oh,
been
totally.
as a
Yes.
kid. But so I was always the one where if people were having disagreements, I was the one in the middle trying to
Yeah.
get them to come together
Yeah.
to some sort of agreement.
Yeah.
Um, and I've always had that long-term strategic perspective on
Mm-hmm.
things,
Mm-hmm.
looking at that big picture, being able to take in all the details, formulate it, and go, here's
Mm-hmm.
the picture, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the last thing is an entrepreneurial mindset.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm the CEO of iNOBL,
Mm-hmm.
and it's a business that I've created and run. And I, you know, I was bored out of my skull when I was 11 years old and went and found a job.
Yeah.
Uh, and I had paper routes. I had my own
Yeah.
businesses,
Yeah.
uh, all through all
Yeah.
through my childhood. I even used
Right.
to sell my toys as a kid, right? So, um,
That's
yeah,
awesome. I
yeah,
remember being part of a multi-family garage sale as a kid and bringing over a similar story, and my arms were full of like dolls and stuffed animals, and all the adults were like, "Are you sure you want to like unload all of that?" And I did. I set up a lemonade stand that weekend too. So that's
nice.
an interesting thing. And that thing about being bored, me too. And like, wasn't that a gift at the end of the day? It's like you got to fill that with your own creativity. And I wonder sometimes if kids today, they have all their time filled with all of these activities. Like, do they have that opportunity to be bored and to be creative?
Yeah, right. Like no, I'm aging myself here, but the only technology I had back then was the television, and
Right.
quite frankly, I could only watch so much of Days of Your Lives as a
Right.
10-year-old kid, right?
Right.
So I had to go and do something
Yeah.
else. The greatest thing for me is that when I did go get my first job, it was a simple job. I was sorting empty pop bottles or soda
Yeah,
bottles,
sure.
and I was doing that at a local corner store. But that was my first experience with one of the best bosses
Oh, wow.
ever. Yeah.
Wow. What characteristics might you call out? Like, what made them awesome?
Well, first of all, they put their trust and faith in an 11-year-old kid
Mm,
to show up for work
mm-hmm.
and to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up working for them until I was about 15 when they sold the business,
Mm,
and they grew me
mm,
through that time. I went from sorting pop bottles to basically opening and closing the store,
mm,
running the cash, dealing with
mm.
the bank deposits, that sort of thing, at a very young age,
Mhm.
right? So that them putting that faith in me and trusting me
Right.
really empowered me to want to do good for them.
Yeah. Yeah. You're making me think of the expression about people rise or fall to your level of expectation of
Yeah,
them, and
yeah,
that's beautiful. And trust is something that I want to talk about eventually here, but I
sure.
wanted to talk about this emotional culture approach. This is something we had talked about in our previous
Mhm.
conversation, and the deck that you use, if you can talk about that and the extent that's relevant, how this goes to values, how it's tied to culture, how values are tied to culture, any of that.
Yeah, yeah. Any and all of that. So the it's interesting if we think about how businesses succeed. One of the most, or I guess the biggest part of that is the people behind it, and the people executing on whatever the critical initiatives are. And we have proven through behavioral science that people's performance is impacted by the way that they feel, right? So if I come into work and you yell at me, and I'm upset and I'm, quite frankly, ticked off at you, I'm probably not going to have my most productive day, right?
Mhm.
No matter how hard I try, because those inner emotions and feelings of, maybe a lack of trust or disrespect, not being friendly, etc., drive my behavior. That's behavioral science.
Mhm.
On the other side of that, if I come into work and you're like, hey, it's great to see you, so glad that you're here today, we've got this important project and you are the one that I know that's going to help us get through this, that type of thing. Well, now I feel important, I feel valued, I feel excited, and I'm going to give a lot more to what needs to be done, right? So there's a quote here I have on my desk, and it's from Maya Angelou, and it says, people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel, right?
Mhm.
And so what this culture piece is and how it ties into values is, what are the expectations of how people behave and show up in the workplace,
Mhm.
right? And how do we want people to feel, and how do we want to make sure they don't feel, right?
Mhm.
So this culture deck is just one tool that I have in my arsenal that is just an easy way for people to identify, how do we want our employees to feel? How do I want to feel? How do we not want to feel? And with that, you can actually map out. You can use it as a values exercise, or you can map it out as, how do we want to shape our organizational culture? And when you are shaping out that organizational culture, it's then figuring, okay, well, if we want people to feel respected, then
Mhm.
what do we need to make sure that we do to make that happen?
Right.
And at what touch points in their career, right?
Yeah.
So when we meet them for that first interview, on their first day of work, during their one-on-one meetings,
Mhm.
hoping that they have them,
Mhm.
uh, during their work anniversaries, all the way through to the point that they decide that they're going to leave your organization.
Yeah.
Again, how do you want them to feel? Right.
Yeah.
So that's how that fits.
Okay. So what's clearer or easier for me to wrap my head around is, how do we want to treat people? Like, I feel like I can control my behaviors
Mhm.
with other people,
Yeah.
especially if I've taken care of myself, if I've
Yeah.
set myself up for success so that I'm, in a best place. But I'm a little bit sensitive to language around assuming that we can, I'm going to use the word control. How other people feel. And this is actually something that is kind of going on right now in the modern workplace, that
Mhm.
there are some executives that feel that everyone should have joy going into the office,
Oh,
and
fantastic.
others who have to actually deal with the commute and childcare and a number of other things, who might
Mhm.
sarcastically say, I'm glad that you want me to feel that way, but I'd be better off spending more time with my family, not in traffic and all those. So, I mean, this is an extreme, and
Yeah,
there
but
is
let's play with it.
something. Yeah, go ahead.
So what's the opposite of joy? What, I don't know, what, misery,
Pain.
pain,
Yeah. Dread. I don't know any of
dread,
those things.
dread. Okay,
Sure.
let's use dread, right? So, as part of our leadership exercise, we might you might have spoken up and said, hey, this is what I think, etc. And it's like, okay, so what can we do, rather than saying what can we do to make sure that every employee has joy when they come to work,
Mhm.
because as you said, it may not be a
Mhm.
realistic expectation.
Right.
Well, then what can we do to make sure that we do not create a sense of dread
Mm.
when people come to the workplace,
Right.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So uh,
It,
you're right. Like, I cannot control how you feel, but
right. Right.
I can control the environment that you're in that could sway how you feel.
Right. Right. Yes, and those are important things to note. I think what you're describing is more specific and more deliberate than I think what many organizations do. I think they kind of paint these broad strokes, and they don't really look to um I think I've read in Brene Brown's book, operationalize the behaviors that would actually
Mhm.
make the values come to life in a very tangible way, that in a
Yes.
meaningful way. And that takes time and thought and care and people have to think that it matters. Right?
Absolutely, right. And so there's I'm reminded of the times I worked in high tech, and they'd come out and they'd say, "Hey, everybody, we've got new name badges for you, or we've got this sticker that we want you to put on the back of your name badge." And on the sticker, it was, "Here's the 10 corporate values of our
Right.
company."
Right.
And there's posters up on the wall about, "Here's
Right.
our values," etc. And it's like, bleh.
Right.
Like who cares? I
Right.
don't care,
Right.
because many times it's either a group of HR or a group of senior leaders that have huddled together in a small room
Yeah.
and spent half a day and said, "What are the values? Because we know we need to create this values thing. Let's
Mm-hmm.
do it."
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they're just checking the box, right?
Right. Right.
And as you said, they're not operationalizing it. So, you could spend some effort and just do that and
Mm-hmm.
waste the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we could tell the impact just based on what you said. What's the impact of that on the employees? They don't feel a, they don't feel a connection to it
Right.
whatsoever.
Right.
So there's a much simpler and more effective way to do this, but it takes a little bit more work. And that's
Mm.
actually to involve the employees in
Right.
creating this,
Yeah.
and to hear what is it that they want.
Yep.
What is their ideal?
Right.
What is the current from their perspective? Right?
Yeah. And so when you're working with an organization, I would think that you're working with people who have kind of already drunk the Kool-Aid, if you will, who kind of already understand the importance of this type of work. Um,
Mhm.
Maybe. Okay. Or maybe they're coming to you with a different, what they think is the perceived issue versus the real, that type of thing.
Yeah.
Um, like, is there anything you
A
could
lot
say?
of a
Yeah.
lot of the time they're like, "Hey, we've got this problem. We need you to deliver some training.
Right.
That's going to fix it."
Right.
It's like,
Exactly.
no, no, no. Training's not
Right.
going to fix it.
Right. Right. And what do you think the hesitation is? This is, again, very broad strokes. We're bucketing and everything, but
Yep.
for organizations that are hesitant to involve all strata of their employee hierarchy in these types of feedback, considerations, discussions.
Yeah, it can absolutely be a challenge. And sometimes, from my perspective, I need to be a little bit strategic in how I approach that with the senior leadership. So I can give you a perfect example of a client that I'm currently working with, who will remain unnamed.
Sure.
But they've their executive team is, I think it's 18 leaders, and they've got a leadership problem. And that the way those leaders are interacting with their employees is creating major problems with retention and attraction, customer satisfaction, the quality of work that's being put out, etc. And that is having a huge impact on the reputation of the organization in itself.
Mm.
However, there's only one person that thinks that this is a priority and is important, and that's the we'll call them the CEO.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're asking for my help to try and influence the rest of the organization. So really, what I'm doing with them is mapping out what their culture is. So there's an assessment that I'm doing with all of their employees to identify what is the organizational culture.
Mm-hmm.
And then the leaders are also going to be looking at what do they want the desired culture to be. And we're going to compare the two.
Mm-hmm.
The method to my madness here is I suspect that the results are going to come back and it's not going to be a pretty picture.
Mm-hmm.
And it'll help to open the eyes of these leaders into
Yeah.
the additional work that they need to do, right? But first
Yeah.
step is for them to see there's actually a problem,
Mm-hmm.
rather than just getting feedback from the occasional employee that
Right.
leaves, right?
Yeah.
So this approach has worked in the past. I've used it with another organization. In that case, the CEO said, "Hey, my executive team is having challenges working together. Can you help me?"
Yeah.
And with them, again, we mapped out how is that executive team behaving, and then mapped out how is that influencing the rest of the organization all the way down to the lowest employee.
Yeah.
And they were shocked to see that the dysfunctional behavior of the senior leadership was being emulated throughout
Right.
the organization.
Yes. Yeah. That's huge. And I want to say more on that. But
Sure.
I'm curious about the assessment that you are having all of the employees, the culture assessment. Can
That's
you give
right.
me an example of a question or two, or like an actual question, or what you're, how you would, if you can? Maybe it's more complicated. You don't want to simplify into one question.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So there's a whole bunch of questions, but
Okay.
it would be things around decision making and what you think is expected of you
Okay.
in making decisions, making bold choices, how risk tolerant the organization
Okay.
is. Do they feel empowered to do their
Mm-hmm.
work?
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Those
Okay.
categories, I'll keep it at that
Right.
level.
Okay. All right. Very good. And then as far as employees emulating the behavior of the executives, and I mean, I almost want to say the parents, it's like
Yeah. Well,
it's so obvious sometimes, and yet so not considered, or the lack of awareness around it is unbelievable. I mean, they're
right.
they're 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 acting exactly the same as they're being shown.
Yes. It's a human phenomenon. I don't know how
Yeah.
to describe it other than we emulate the behaviors of those people that we
Right.
look up to and that we respect.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So whether that be other family members,
Yeah.
our parents,
Right.
somebody in our community,
Right.
but we, we spend a lot of time working.
Yeah.
So we're obviously
Yes.
going to start emulating the people that we're with on a regular basis. It will be interesting to see how that shows up with so many people working remotely now,
Yeah.
because they're not seeing the behaviors as much
Right.
from other people.
Yeah. And in some ways that might be freeing. I'd argue, and actually I'm going to have someone on the podcast in the next few weeks that will be talking more about why it is that we pick up certain behaviors, or do some of these things,
Mhm.
more from there's psychology to the background of what he does, but that's not the full picture. It is true. I know this from the reading and other things I've done, that there is some, there's some safety in behaving in a way that your boss is going to understand,
Mhm.
and so if you kind of make the same kind of jokes, even if they're disparaging, maybe even towards your clients or your internal clients or external, that you're going to get approval if you kind of maintain that similar mindset. And this now goes into diversity, inclusion, and
Yeah.
have the ability to express a differing opinion and have that be okay. That's probably, if it is okay, you're probably getting more towards the good boss. But if it's not okay, you're probably getting more towards the bad boss.
Yes. I don't remember the article, but recently I read something about psychological safety is one thing,
Right.
where with psychological safety you feel able to share ideas
Yes.
with the and speak up and,
Right.
and talk with your group and your team, etc. But this article also talked about psychological safety is one thing, but you also need the ability to disagree
Yeah.
and debate
Mhm.
with other people in the
Yeah.
organization.
Right.
And without that, then you just have a whole bunch of people that are saying, yeah, whatever our bosses
Yeah.
say.
Right. And this just popped into my head, something that I've observed on I play golf not very well. And I'm more often with men than I am with women playing golf.
Okay.
And I've noticed that guys will get irritated at each other.
I love how you're shaking your head.
I know, because I realized my judgment as I've started to shake my head about this, but
Right.
I want to really kind of remove and be a little more neutral, because I feel like I've learned they'll get frustrated at each other, but also just really frustrated with themselves, right? Because that's
Mhm.
what some of these types of sports do. Um, they'll have a little kerfuffle, whatever, and the next hole they're completely fine, right?
Oh, yes.
And
They don't hold on to the emotion.
whereas I feel like if I am playing with a foursome and we're all women and something weird happened at hole two, it's going to be weird. It might be weird for several holes, and
Mhm.
I've become more and more aware of this, and am just, I feel like I'm better at kind of working through and getting that is a place where I feel like I'd prefer to be able to let go of some that I think that has to do with conditioning and ways that we've been brought up. But this absolutely plays out in the workplace too. The
Oh,
ability
yeah.
sometimes where I'll be on a call and there happen to be more men than women, and a couple of people of equal, maybe managing directors, so executive level, kind of going back and forth a little bit. But
Mhm.
I know when they pass each other in the hall or see each other at the next meeting, they're fine.
Well, yeah.
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 I think in the workplace, well, anywhere, I guess it really depends on the relationship that you have with the individuals that you're
Right.
disagreeing with or debating with, or calling them on something.
Right.
Um, right. Some people really want that and appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
And in my books, as long as you have positive intent
Yeah.
and you are doing it in a way that's not throwing the other person under the bus,
Right.
then go for it. Right? What
Yeah.
Absolutely go for it. But it is that leadership team that sets the example of,
Yeah.
is that okay? So if you're
Right.
my boss and I go to you and say, hey, you know what, that project that just ran, it here's like 5 spots that it really missed the mark. Next time
Yeah.
I think we could do it differently.
Yeah.
If you really get upset at me and say, hey, I don't want to hear that, and you don't know what you're talking about, etc., I'm likely never going to share
Right.
that type of information again
Right.
with you.
Right.
But instead, if you are a little bit more emotionally intelligent, then you're
Right.
going to say, hey, thanks very much for that feedback. I'm so glad that you're thinking about these things.
Right.
I may not agree with all of them, but there's
Yeah.
definitely some lessons here for us.
Yeah. I do think that having someone modeled a better way or a more thoughtful way to give feedback is important, because I've definitely seen feedback not be thoughtfully delivered.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And I've said it before on this podcast that there is some research around what you just said, that you're exactly right, that people will not go to that person again. They think that person cannot handle this. So no other feedback will be brought to them. And that completely stunts your growth as an individual contributor. And another thing I'd like to repeat, I've said it before on this podcast, is that even if it's not packaged well, if the person is delivering it terribly and it feels hurtful and it's just a terrible experience, there's almost always some nugget that is worth taking
Oh, yeah.
and growing from. And maybe if it's super painful in the moment, don't try to think about what that is immediately. Give it a few days,
Yeah.
and it's about growth. At the end of the day, all of this growth for organizations, but really these human frustrations they're all leading edge for growth for any of us.
Absolutely. And you know what? We're all flawed to some
Absolutely.
degree,
Yeah.
right? We don't, we're not eloquent all the time. We don't say the
Right.
right things all the time.
Right.
And I keep reminding myself and other people that I don't know what the number is, 99.7% of the population does not wake up every morning thinking, I'm going to make Linda's life miserable today.
Absolutely. Right.
Right. So even if you've got the biggest jerk of a boss,
Right.
most likely they're not waking up thinking, I'm going to make my staff's life miserable
Right.
today.
Right.
Right. So we need to start thinking about, well, what's driving their behavior?
Right.
Who's driving their behavior? And
Right.
what is the meaning of what they're getting at? And what can we do to try and help resolve that situation? That's not always easy. Like I said, I've had the good, the bad, and the ugly. But sometimes you can work through it.
Yeah. 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 Talking about trust and doing these types of exercises using the deck that you referred to earlier, I wanted to just ask how this actually plays out. Are people suggesting and expressing out loud? Is there a high level of trust already built? Is trust built into the exercise? How are they feeling safe in an environment where people are doing a kind of activity around getting clear on values with your method?
Yeah, trust and safety are really critical to this, and building that into how it's done. So this is where you really need to have an expert facilitator leading conversation. Or it's best if you do. That way they can look for signs of uh, breaking trust, and they can build in trust throughout the piece. One of the great things in the way that it's done is, rather than having every single person say, hey, here's how I think that we should feel at work, etc., there's a lot of group activity that takes every individual's data points and comes up with, let's say, a top 5, and then that group will post up, hey, here's the top 5. So the fact that somebody is representing their group creates safety in itself.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And then with all of those groups, you've got a whole bunch. You still now have more data than you need. So then, as the whole crew, you can vote on, okay, out of these 20 that are up on the board, which ones are the top 5, right?
Yeah.
So not only do people get to express themselves individually, but they get to discuss it in a smaller group and then in a larger group, and they get to contribute to what the final outcome is. So there's trust built into the process, and there's trust in the outcomes because every individual had an opportunity to contribute to it, which really means that you're more likely to be successful with those outcomes, implementing them or bringing it to life,
right,
than if you had just done it with a group of executives in a closed room.
Yeah. And I think you said that as a facilitator, you might see times when trust is being violated a bit, like you witness it, and then do you take action? What does that look like?
Yeah, you definitely take action, right? So I don't know how many times have you ever been in a meeting or sharing ideas, and somebody accidentally says, "Oh my gosh, that's such a dumb idea," or "I can't believe you said that," right? Well, that shuts people down.
Totally.
Right? So you want to address that at the beginning of the workshop in terms of how are we going to behave, what are we expecting from each other, how can we make this that safe, trusting environment. And then if it does still come up, then there's a number of different ways that you can deal with that, either as a group or individually with the I'll call them the offender.
Yeah. I've also had the experience where someone might be over indexing, very expressive in a meeting, and almost maybe a little bit of an outlier even, and kind of, I guess that also goes to the setup, the initial setup, but then also kind of handling it inside. You don't want a derailing, but you also want to be able to acknowledge what this person is saying and sharing.
Yes, exactly, right. And so there's a number of facilitation techniques that are going to help deal with that. Things like parking lots, acknowledging what people are saying, deciding in the moment, hey, is this something what the whole group wants to dig in more on?
Right.
So do we deviate from what we're talking about, or do we stick with the plan?
Right.
Lots of different ways of doing that.
Yes, indeed. Another thing you had said in our other discussion, you were talking about agreement, team level agreement, what a team stands for. And then you also just kind of called out, is it really a team or is it just a group of people? Is there anything more you could say about that?
Yeah, so I work with a lot of, I'm going to loosely use the word teams, and helping them figure out what are we doing, what's working, how are we working together, and are we getting the results that we need. And to me, this might be a bit of a dated term, but like I remember in high tech, we'd strike these tiger teams, and it was there's this really gnarly problem or situation that needs to be solved, and so we'd grab people from across the organization to come together. It's like the meeting of the minds, let's say. And they would come together and they would work out, okay, what's the problem, what's the plan, how are we going to execute on this, etc. And once that was resolved, they would go back to their functions, right? So that to me is a team where you need everybody on the team to contribute to a singular problem and then get it done and then move on. Whereas groups we seem to use the word team instead of groups.
Yes.
So a working group is like, if I'm a a team of software developers, well, there might be one team that's working on developing a new release. There might be another team that's working on quality assurance and
Right.
another team that's working on support.
Mm-hmm.
They all report up to a singular
Right.
leader
Right.
who says, this is my team, but you've got three
Yeah.
silos
Yeah. Yeah.
that
Okay.
rarely, if ever, are working together on a gnarly issue, right? So,
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I like that distinction. It's interesting. The term is thrown everywhere. It's overused in
well,
this.
exactly. Just like manager and leader, like
Yeah.
what's the difference? And there are
Right.
differences, but it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Okay.
but yeah,
Yeah. No, that's cool. And I even love that, like, this group that came together for this one thing is a team for a period of time, and they're not anymore.
yeah, and that goes with many people have probably heard of forming, storming, norming, performing, and
Yeah. Yeah.
adjourning, right?
Hmm.
Well, if you're
Hmm.
not adjourning, then you're probably not a team. You're
Oh,
a
okay.
group.
Okay.
Right?
No, that's awesome. That's awesome. How about the organizational culture inventory? Is this what you were referring to before when you were talking about the
Yes.
assessment? Is it the same thing? Okay. When it's completed, are you presenting a report? Are you just giving some anecdotal quotes? Or like how does that look in terms of its deliverable? Or their graphs, charts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, what is that? And what
Yeah.
are those results? The assessment is based on a lot of research.
Hmm.
I'm thinking 3 or 4 decades of research and comparison to other organizations that are successful or not successful.
Hmm.
And so after an organization does this culture inventory, they get a graphic that shows them how they are performing compared to
Oh, they
other
love that. They
organizations.
love that. Okay.
And it maps it out into 12 different quadrants based
Okay.
on constructive behaviors, uh, passive aggressive, and passive defensive behaviors. And
Mm.
while those last two sound negative, you actually do want to
Hmm.
have a little bit of them.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
and so, yeah, it really helps them to identify where are they the strongest,
Hmm.
where do they have the most opportunity to grow and develop,
Hmm.
and what is hitting them the hardest, right? And it's quite an eye opener for people when they see them.
Hmm. It makes sense to me that some amount of passive aggression is important or needed. Can you give a quick example of that?
One of the pieces of the puzzle would be, let's say, perfectionism.
Okay.
Okay, so somebody that is extremely perfectionistic, eh, as you know, they get stuck and things don't get
Hmm.
out the door because it's
Hmm.
never right.
Right.
It has to
You're
be
right.
110%.
Right.
And they have very low tolerance for risk,
Yeah.
etc.
Hmm.
Well, that can be paralyzing for an organization.
Hmm.
But on the other end of the spectrum is somebody that throws caution to the wind
Hmm.
and doesn't put in the right amount of effort
Hmm.
to get things right.
Hmm.
And that can cause problems with how they are perceived by internal and external clients, right?
Sure. Hmm.
Um, and somebody that is completely tolerant of risk and is like, yeah, $1 million investment, who cares if it works, right?
Hmm.
Well, organizations don't have $1 million to just throw around.
Right.
So you need some level of that, but
Hmm.
not too much,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And finding out what's the right level and where is your organization as a whole is
Hmm.
part of that assessment, right?
Hmm.
And comparing that to known organizations that are functioning well.
Hmm. Okay. Cool. So before I ask you the final question that I ask everyone, I want to know a couple of things. Is there anything else that you want to say or that you wish I had asked more directly that didn't? And how do people connect with you and anything you want to say about how you work with clients?
Now, that's a great question. Is there anything that you didn't ask? I don't know. I think we've had a really great conversation.
I do too.
And I actually can't think of anything that you
Okay.
didn't ask me. It's, because you and I could talk for hours and hours and hours, but
Probably.
I'm sure people don't want to listen to it for hours and hours and
Sure.
hours.
And then people can reach you and connect with
Yes,
you.
yes. The best way to connect with me is via my website. You can go on see a little bit more about who we are and what we do at iNOBL. So it's iNOBL.com. And on there's an opportunity you can schedule a call, and would love to have a conversation. The way we approach things is we're not trying to sell people stuff. An initial conversation is truly just a conversation to see, who are you? Who are we?
Yeah.
Is there some way we can help each other? If not, fantastic.
All right.
And if so, even better.
Awesome. And the question I like to ask everyone is how you are valued. Well, I like to ask across. What did it mean to be valued in your work early in your career? Like, how did you know you were valued or not? And then how that's evolved over time. How do you know, or what feels most, impactful now?
Yeah. When I was working in the corporate world for a boss, one of the ways that I felt that I was valued, and I knew that I was valued, and it made me feel good, was I was growing and developing, right? So I could see forward momentum. And that didn't necessarily mean that I was getting pay raises. It didn't necessarily mean that I was getting promotions. All those are great things to have. But what was the most important for me was the ability to get involved in interesting projects and to continue to learn and develop my skills, which really is about just getting involved and being able to influence decision making in the organization.
Nice.
So for me, that was the biggest piece as an employee. Now I tell people I work for the biggest jerk in the world, and that's myself. So the working for yourself is very interesting, and what motivates me and makes me feel valued is a lot different, right? So I love having the privilege to take a dive into another organization and see the light bulbs go off, and to help people make those connections so that they can, like I said earlier, close the strategy to execution gap, so they can see how can they maximize the buy-in of their leaders, how can they get alignment and execution happening for their most critical strategic initiatives. So when they start seeing that happen, I feel fantastic, right? And that to me is the biggest win.
That is awesome. Well, Kevin, I've enjoyed this so much. I hope others enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed it. Thanks again for being on.
Thanks, Linda.
Hopefully we'll talk soon.
It's my pleasure.
All right. Bye. There you have it. Episode 26 is in the books. A big thank you to Kevin for indulging me in this conversation. If you found this content useful, please subscribe on whatever platform you use, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, whichever. I would love a comment. The more listener activity a show has, so subscriptions, comments, likes, whatever those things can be, the higher chances that other folks who would enjoy the same type of content would actually find it. It just helps the algorithm bring this one up higher if someone were to Google, say, toxic workplace or something like that. I hope you are doing well in your work and in your life, seeking to up-level the experience for humans in your environment by shoring yourself up and living your values with integrity, even when things feel like a shit show. As always, please send any comments or messages my way. You can send a note or a recorded message to linda@workdopepod.com. That's Linda at WORKDOPEPOD.com. Until next time, this is Linda Stacy signing off for Work Dope. Bye-bye.